How would you like to introduce yourself? People who might not be familiar with you or your work.
My name is Iain MacGregor. I'm known for history. This is my third book. I love doing the eyewitness testimonies. That's really amazing, meeting survivors, eyewitnesses. So my first book was on the Berlin Wall. Second book was on Soviet propaganda in World War II at their greatest victory, Stalingrad. And then this one is on Hiroshima.
So obviously you've written about Stalingrad. You've written about Checkpoint Charlie. What was the through line that took you to Hiroshima? Was it just personal fascination? Or?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, and happenstance. So it was when we had the lockdown in COVID, and I was researching my Stalingrad book, and I wanted to go to a museum in Volgograd. That's modern day Stalingrad, because it has this amazing archive of testimonies. And the museum director there is about my age, and he's very much I don't know what's happened to him, by the way, since Ukraine, but he was very much of, I want to get Western historians into the museum because no one really comes to see our archive. So he signed this documentation that allowed me special permission to travel. It's amazing. So I went to an empty Heathrow airport, got on a plane that was pretty much empty, flew to Moscow, then got on another plane to get down to Volgograd because it's in the Caucasus. And I'm in this archive for a week, and it's wintertime, minus 20 outside. I mean, it was amazing. You can make a movie out of it. It's like The Shining.
That's quite an experience.
Empty museum. And he said, you've got the run of the place. Just don't, just go and have a look anywhere you want. So one room I went into one afternoon. It's a huge, huge room. It's like about 50, 60 feet long, 30 foot wide. And it just seemed to be full of trophies and mementos. And I thought, that's odd. It's not what you normally see in a museum. So I asked him, and he said, well, these are presents that cities that also got destroyed in the Second World War. It's almost like a twinning thing. Yeah. They wanted to give us a present to show affinity with us. So Coventry sent, there's a big sword there. It's called the Sword of Stalingrad, and it was presented by Winston Churchill to Stalin at one of the conferences. I think it was Potsdam. To say, not well done, but as in we feel your pain because your city was completely destroyed, Stalingrad was. Yeah. But there was this massive diorama of the atomic dome from Hiroshima. And that's when I asked the question. I said, well, why is that there? And he said, well, yeah, they gave us that in the 1970s, but it's to show an affinity to both cities. So that just lodged in my skull. And so when I finished the Stalingrad book and my publisher sits down with me and says, what would you like to do next? I said, well, if there's a story, there's an angle, a really interesting angle, that's obviously commercial too, I'd like to do it. So that's where we've ended up with this book.
Was it, in terms of the perspective that you've attacked it from, was that just because you thought there's like a lack of that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the world does not need another book on Hiroshima. I mean, there's lots and lots and lots. But I wanted to do a book that charted a different story. That's why it's called the Hiroshima Men, because you go to get the reader to understand why would America drop an atomic bomb on human beings. I wanted to show them this journey that's before the war, during the war, that shows you not just the science and the Manhattan Project, etc., and the race for the bomb. I wanted to tell them, why is there a race for the bomb? Why is the fighting in the Pacific so brutal that then it's logical by the summer of 1945 that the Americans are thinking, right, we're just going to drop this bomb because we want to force them to surrender. Enough of this. Thousands of people are dying every week. They're still not surrendering. And that's the storyline. And I tell it through the prism of four key people. They've all got different journeys, different backgrounds, different lives. American and Japanese, and it will give the reader, I hope, a 360-degree kind of viewpoint. So you see both sides' points of view of what happens.
So did it... I don't presume to know what your views on the use of the atomic bomb were before, but did your research maybe change your perspective?
Yeah, it radically changed in terms of two things. Is I didn't really know how extensive the destruction was of Japan before they even dropped the bombs. So you've got all this fighting going on through the Pacific as the Americans are island hopping their way towards Japan. And it was always their strategy. Even before the war, they'd worked out a military strategy. If they went to war with Japan, how would they defeat them? And it was always going to be, we'll either have a definitive, decisive naval battle and destroy their navy, and then we'll be able to easily take the country because we'll blockade them, starve them, because that would work. And the other one was, or we invest massively in a long-range bomber, which a lot of countries were doing. We did with the Lancaster, and we'll bomb them into surrender. And that had actually worked. So for the first 6 months of 1945, by the time they were in range and they got to this island chain called the Marianas, which is around about 1,500 miles away to the southeast of Japan, they've got the B-29 Super Fortress, which was the weapon. My argument is it's the most decisive weapon of the Second World War because it wins the war in the Pacific. Huge plane, can fly at 35,000 feet minimum. It's got the world's first air pressurized cabin, remote controlled guns. It's armed to the teeth, hence it's called the Super Fortress. It's got an enormous bomb bay, huge 4 engines, so it's got a range of about 3,000 kilometers. So Japan's easy prey. And then it invents, this is what I find humorous, Harvard University, they invent napalm. You won't find a plaque or anything at Harvard University to say we invented napalm, quite rightly.
Yes, probably not one
but it's a deadly incendiary, as we know, because it's been used in other wars like Korea and Vietnam. And that's the primary weapon they used to defeat Japan, really. The atomic bombs is kind of the end game. But for the first 4 months of 1945, from March through to August, they bombed 66 cities across Japan. They burned to ashes 40% of urban landscape in Japan. They dehouse, it's incredible, the statistics. They dehouse 8.5 million civilians and kill 1 million. And they're mainly elderly and the women and children, because obviously the men are fighting abroad. So they'd done all that before the atomic bombs. So that's what I found. I didn't know. I knew vaguely that they'd done the bombing campaign, but when I got really deep in the weeds of the research, I was like, my God.
I suppose you begin to understand how one-sided it was.
Yeah, and that's when you really think, how crazy were the Japanese military leadership to start this thing?
I mean, I have, a fragment of memory from GCSE history. I guess the prevailing narrative is that the Japanese were never going to surrender.
Never. Well, that's the thing. And again, that's why the decisions made to drop the bombs is the fact that President Truman's in charge because President Roosevelt, who's pretty much been the steward for America throughout the war, dies suddenly of a stroke. Truman's in charge as his vice president. He's been kept in the dark because it's almost like a dereliction of duty. He just keeps him out of all the key meetings. But the man does a brilliant job. But he's seen that in the last year of fighting, so from D-Day in June 44 through to the end of the war in May in Europe, the Nazi leadership fights to the finish. And what's happened is the Allies literally have to overrun and destroy the whole country. Germany's destroyed, its cities are destroyed, its inhabitants are dehoused, housing's destroyed, and millions of people are casualties in the fighting, etc., etc. He's seen that. He's got the same issue with the Japanese. They're going to go down fighting because it's a hardcore leadership that are in charge. And even though he said we want unconditional surrender, they think that means the emperor's going to go as well, and they're just not going to have that because they see that you get rid of the emperor, it's societal collapse. They could end up like the Soviet Union. So that's what he's faced with. Is we've literally got to overrun the country. We've got to invade Japan. And so he's being told by his military strategists, this doomsday scenario, which is pretty accurate, is if you look at all the island hopping campaign, the casualties we've had to take, not just ourselves, but how many, the Japanese are fighting almost to the last man. It's a cliche, but that's what's happened. And all the civilian casualties. So the last great battle before they get to Japan is Okinawa, which is about 700 miles off the Japanese coast, but it's considered Japan home soil, sovereign soil. Americans take 60,000 casualties. The US Pacific Fleet that's parked off Okinawa, directing operations, they lose dozens of ships. But more importantly, There's a garrison on the island, Japanese garrison, 120,000. They almost fight to the last man. There's roughly 100,000 Japanese civilians get killed too. So to jump ahead, Truman's told by the strategists, if we invade Japan, it'll roughly cost us 1 million casualties in military personnel, and we're probably going to kill 4 million Japanese.
But the numbers are quite staggering.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah.
So you could imagine that he's thinking, I've been told now I'm president, I've found out about the Manhattan Project. I've got this wonder weapon, super weapon, that one bomb's got the equivalent of 15 to 20,000 tons of TNT. And your listeners might not know this, but Truman himself was a great war veteran. He fought on the Western Front in France, northern France, as an artillery officer, saw action. So he knows the power of TNT. And he'll have thought, wow, I've never known one shell, 20,000 tons of TNT, that's insane. But he knows as a politician, that's my ace in the hole. That might win me the war quickly. I want to finish this war. The fighting's just getting insane. We're losing thousands of people every week and still they're not giving up. Maybe that will drive the Japanese to surrender if we use it. So that's why it's used. Simple as that, to save lives. His reasoning was it was to save lives, and you can't help but agree with that.
Right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the characters in the book. First and foremost, obviously the prologue centres around quite a powerful interview with Michiko Kodama, a survivor. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's the creative side of me, and I know that I've got to draw the reader in straight away into the book, and I want to hit them in the solar plexus because it's a powerful story. Yeah. It's not there's no happy ending. Millions of people are dying, and you're dropping these atomic bombs, which is an horrific way to die, and it's horrific to survive. So with Michiko, she's the Assistant Secretary General of one of the more famous atomic survivors groups, and I'm going to pronounce it terribly, but to my knowledge, it's the Nihon Hidanko.
Okay.
And they've just won the Nobel Peace Prize last November, because of the work they do. So she sat down with me, and I was in Japan for 2 weeks doing research and interviewing. So I interviewed about a dozen Japanese survivors, not just of the atomic bombs, but of the incendiaries as well, because I wanted to get both sides of the story. And it was only supposed to be, it's my first interview on a Monday morning, and it was going to be for an hour. We'd agreed to questions beforehand. A good friend of mine who's Japanese American had come in from LA to be there, because I don't speak or read Japanese. And it's got to be 100% accurate, so that's why she was there. So we went through her life, and her story was she was from a wealthy family. They had a massive house in the center, right down by the harbor in Hiroshima, because it's a port city.
Yeah.
And because of all these incendiary raids going on across Japan, Hiroshima hadn't been touched. They thought, oh, wow, we haven't been touched. That's lucky. But they didn't know that's because the cities on the target committee's list in America for we need fresh cities to use these atomic bombs, because then we can, after the war, we can accurately gauge the destruction of them. They don't know that. But what the authorities in Japan are doing is they've instructed the cities that are still left to tear down buildings to create fire breaks because of these incendiaries. So her family lost their house, but because they were wealthy, they had other houses. So they'd moved, fortunately for them, about 1.5 miles outside of ground zero, up the hill towards the mountains. And so I start my story. She's a 10-year-old. Her dad's just dropped her off at her new school. And she's sitting down at her desk, and then this blinding flash of lights.
Christ.
And then her world turns upside down. And that's the story I tell in the prologue, is her father comes and rescues her, because her school's totally flattened, even though they're 1.5 miles outside the radius. The bomb blast, they're not destroyed, or they don't die from the radiation or the heat blast. They're too far away, but the actual explosive blast knocks the building down. Lots of her schoolmates are killed or injured, as well as the teachers. She's covered in shards of glass. She's bleeding, but she's alive. Her dad comes to get her, and he says, well, we've got to cross town to get to your grandparents' house in safety. Get on my back. So I tell the story in the prologue of what she sees, and it's horrific.
Yeah.
I won't give spoiler alerts, but obviously she's seeing the dead and the dying that are within the bomb blast. And I thought, we finished after an hour and we were rising to say goodbye. And she said, well, don't you want to know my life after the war? I said, yeah, of course we do. Absolutely. So we sit down again. And that took another 2 hours. And again, to cut a long story short, she's talking about how the atomic survivors, the Hibashka, they're shunned by Japanese society because they don't understand the science, the biological science of radiation poisoning.
Oh, okay.
They see it as some evil disease that can be transmitted. So she goes on this odyssey for decades of from job to job because people find out where she's from. Guys won't marry her, and if they do propose, as soon as their families find out where she's from, she never hears from them again. She does marry in the end, has a daughter. But to close this really terrible story, really sad story, she says basically all her family eventually over the years die of cancer, including her daughter. Yeah, exactly. Your face. And by the time she's gone through all this, my translator's in tears. And that's the prologue. So that's Machiko's story. But she joined this lobbying group. Because it's not just about their lobbying the world to disarm nuclear weapons. They've been lobbying their own government for decades for medical compensation, treatment. They want their medical bills paid for because thousands of their members over the years have passed away from cancer, not just from old age, but from cancer. And that's why they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's her story. And I just thought it's a really important story, and it's a real metaphor for the destruction of Hiroshima.
Yeah, but that sensibility is fascinating as well. That they shun them. Still goes on today. Yeah, that's wild. The next person I wanted to talk about was Senkichi Iwaya, the mayor of Hiroshima. So, did you get a sense, sort of a wider sense of what the city was like before the bomb through Senkichi? Yeah, and
I did research anyway, and I went to the city's admin archives that have got the basics. You got to remember that. So obviously, when the atomic bomb exploded, it destroyed the administrative centre of the of the city as well. So a lot of the records incinerated, gone. But there are some still things left, photographs and diagrams and reports. So that gave me a good picture of what the city was like. And again, that's why the incendiary raids had worked so well across Japan. Is at that time, Japan's not the city. Japan is not how we see it today, where it's built it's a vision of America, isn't it? Because the Americans rebuilt it after the war. It's big high-rise blocks of flats, administrative buildings, business buildings, all that kind of thing. But back then, it was very, very traditional Japanese two-story dwellings, sliding doors made from wood and paper. That's why the Americans had planned their incendiary raids, because they knew they would go like a torch. And Hiroshima was no different. It did have some big administrative buildings and hotels and the main train station. They were mainly designed and built by foreign companies, primarily American and some British and French. And they're the ones. So the atomic dome that still stands today, the ruin of it, that survived because it was built from reinforced concrete. But so Senkichi's story is basically he was his whole life had been serving civilian government. So he'd started his career in the mid-1920s. He'd come out of the first university that had been created in Japan after the Great War, Tokyo University. That's where he'd been sent. And he was just a very gifted administrator. And his memoir, which his family produced after the war, showed that he was gifted at running police forces. And I don't mean that in an ominous way. He wasn't like Goebbels and the Nazis. He just ran police forces, and he believed fervently in the rule of law, democratic law, because you've got to remember it's like it mirrors Weimar Germany. He worked for a democratic system in the 1920s, and it's only in the 1930s, once after the Great Depression has struck, where standard of living is falling, unemployment's rising, that you then have this drift towards nationalism, which then morphs into authoritarianism, militarism, totalitarianism. He survives through all that period, always believing in the rule of law. So to jump ahead, once he's died at Hiroshima, he's the mayor of Hiroshima. He had several children. So his wife dies of his wife survives the explosion. He doesn't. He dies with his youngest son and granddaughter. His other family are living in other parts of the country, so they survived. But he had several children. Only 3 of them survived the war in the end. And by the 60s, they decided they'd write his kind of memoir, his career memoir. And there's one copy left, and it's in the Tokyo National Library. And I think they put it in there in, 1966, 65, 66. So I found it, and I translated it. And what it does, why it's important and why I wanted to put it in the book, because an English-speaking audience won't know about it, is it's great because it, from a historian's point of view, it charts not only his career, but it charts the fall and rise of Japanese democracy. So, like I said, it shows that how it drifted from democracy into totalitarianism. It starts a war in China, which it gets bogged down in and can't win, and then the insane decision to start a war against the Americans in the Pacific. Yeah. And he lives through all of that. And then at the end of it, tragically, he's told, we're moving you down from Tokyo and we want you to run Hiroshima. And this is 1943 because the authorities know they're losing the war. The Americans eventually will get to Japan and they're probably going to invade it. Japan is their main military hub in the south. So I didn't know this, but the Japanese naval fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor to start the war had actually left from Hiroshima.
Oh, really?
Most of the Japanese soldiers that fought in the Pacific Basin against the Americans and fought against the British in Burma had left from ships in Hiroshima.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So it was always going to be a military target.
Yeah.
And so they thought, we want a really gifted administrator to run the administration in the city, and that's why he got the job. So tragically for him, and then once Tokyo had suffered from huge incendiary raids in 1945, that's when he insisted his wife bring their youngest children down to Hiroshima.
Oh, no. Because
he said, we're safe, we haven't been touched.
That's terrible.
Exactly.
Lastly, I wanted to talk about John Hersey.
Yeah.
Because I think sort of he wrote a pretty seminal article that was probably one of the first bits of writing that humanized, the people who lived in Hiroshima and challenged the prevailing narrative. So how did did you draw any inspiration from that?
Oh yeah, I mean he's my favorite character in the book.
Yeah.
I mean obviously I'm from a publishing background. I work with writers every day of the week, so I would be attracted to someone like him. But I would also argue, ironically, I'm sitting here talking to the Byline Times. So I think he would work for the Byline Times.
Yeah, I mean,
he's just the kind of guy you guys would work with.
Part of the reason I wanted to talk about him as well, I suppose I was sort of attracted to him as a journalist.
Well, I admire him because he was one of the key people that changed the way wartime frontline reporters did their job. So he wanted to join up. So after Pearl Harbor, he had signed papers to enlist in the Navy. He was going to be an officer in the Navy. But he was talked out of it because they said, well, you're a gifted writer. You've been doing great work for the last 5, 6, 7 years across the globe, writing for various magazines and newspapers in New York. We need good writers to cover this war. And he said, well, yeah, but I want to be on the front line. So that's what he did. And he saw some really, really crazy things and witnessed some of the bloodiest fighting. Not just in the Pacific, but in Europe and on the Eastern Front. So
the Ostfront.
He saw in the first big battle Americans fought with the Japanese was at Guadalcanal. He was there for a few weeks, and that's the thing. He insisted that I'm not going to wait at Army headquarters and get the reports coming in from combat troops on the front line, and then I'll write my story. I actually want to be on the front line, and that's what he did. And he went out on jungle patrols where they're getting into firefights.
It's been terrifying.
Exactly, and then jump ahead. He was with the Allied invasion of Sicily and then Italy. Saw fighting there. He flew in American B-24 Liberators, the first bomber attack on Rome. He's in the first wave as a witness. Jump ahead again. and he's on the Eastern Front with the Red Army as they're ploughing through Byelarus and then into Ukraine. And he's seen what, the massive destruction that's going on there.
Particularly gruesome, the Ostfront.
Yeah. So he's seeing all of that, and he survives 4 plane crashes. It's insane. Survives 4 plane crashes. But he's a I was going to say he's a gigging freelance journalist. He needs jobs. He's got a very nice standard of living.
Yeah.
He mixes with the blue bloods and great writers in Manhattan. His wife is the ex-girlfriend of JFK. Interestingly, he reinvents JFK's wartime career. I talk a lot about that, as in JFK had disastrous mishap in the Pacific as a captain commander of a PT torpedo boat. It gets rammed by a Japanese destroyer and sunk. There's a navigation problem. They mess up a nighttime patrol. A couple of his crew are killed, but they survive. But his war's over. But Hersey writes this amazing, glowing story and reinvents him as a war hero. And it's published in Reader's Digest. JFK's dad, the Senator Joe Kennedy, buys 100,000 copies of it and floods the congressional district in Boston, where he then runs his son for office. Wow, he gets elected. So he does that. But yeah, with Hersey, his writing style is amazing. He even had time, with all this wartime reporting, he still had time to write a novel about his experiences in the Italian campaign. It's called A Bell for Adano. Wins the Pulitzer. He wins the Pulitzer. He gets awarded it in 1944. Oh, does all that. I mean, he has a great war.
Yeah.
But I would argue, and I interviewed the family to understand his character, because obviously he died quite a few years ago. And he must have had PTSD because of everything that he saw. But he still then gets this gig to go to Hiroshima after the war, about 6-7 months afterwards, when all these stories are coming out that there's this mysterious disease that people are dying of, what we know is radiation poisoning. A few Western journalists have got in, but they get kicked out by the American authorities, and whatever stories they want to publish gets censored by the military authorities there that General MacArthur's in charge of. He's the Supremo in occupied Japan by now. So Hersey gets in and he does the job, does a great job, because his style of writing is fascinating in terms of it's not a vehicle for him and his ego or his words. It's the people that are going to speak. And that's why his wartime reports on the front line were so good, because he lets the ordinary person doing the fighting speak. That's what he does for these. He spends 2 weeks in Hiroshima. They don't know he's there, the authorities really. Interviews about 36 Japanese, and of that, he distills it down to 6. It's famously called the Hiroshima 6. Ordinary people. But the stories and the way he's able to tell about the terror and the suffering that they witnessed, that's what he brings back to America. That's the article he writes for the New Yorker magazine, which ordinarily would write articles about movies, what Cadillac to buy, what's the fashion on Fifth Avenue, blah blah blah, and it's so powerful. Again, they're not stupid. They've got an editor's nose for a good story. They say, right, we normally publish 6 articles in a magazine, but this is so good, we're going to turn over the whole magazine to this one article. And they do. And it's an overnight sensation. Yeah. I mean, just takes the world by storm.
Are there any questions about Hiroshima that you don't think have been answered sufficiently?
Good question. I think that only because it's front and center right now, because as you and me are talking, it's the day after the 80th anniversary. And you watched all the commemorations, and there was at least 3 people that I'd interviewed that are survivors that texted me this week, because we got into a conversation about, I asked them if they were going to the commemorations, and they were. I mean, again, the fight for compensation and recognition from their own government is still ongoing. You could argue the government's just, successive Japanese governments have played it out because they're all dying off. And most of the key figures that were interviewed and that were on BBC News, for instance, yesterday for the 80th, they're all in their 90s. So they won't be around for much longer. And then the problem's almost gone by its own volition. I think that's the main issue is, why hasn't anything been done about this? Why haven't the government stepped up and looked at some kind of recompense for these people that had the atomic bombs dropped on them. You could argue, which is what I discussed with these people 2 years ago when I was over there interviewing, that it's a Pandora's box, because then, because of this insane war that the Japanese government at the time started, they are to blame for what happened to their own people.
Yeah.
And if you then pay the atomic survivors, what do you do about the millions and millions of Japanese that were then dehoused or killed by the incendiary raids? And then it has a domino effect of the Japanese could say, like the Russians have said to the Germans over the last decade, well, we want reparations for what you did to our country.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen like that in the real world, does it?
Yeah.
So that's the big question. And then again, it's I would say it might not be the only critical thing I would say that I had on my research trip was if you go to the main museum in Tokyo, and it's a brilliant museum, really interactive, really interesting, but it's a museum of the history of Japan, the whole history of Japan. But the big section on the First and Second World War, especially the Second World War, is really good. It's on the par with the Imperial War Museum here in London. But the key thing is, if you know your history like I do, I spent half my time reading the captions to a lot of the things that they were saying, especially about the Pacific War.
Yeah.
I was just stroking my chin going, really?
Yeah.
Is that the way you see how things played out?
Yeah.
Because the overwhelming theory or justification for the war was it was forced upon them. And you think, okay, well, I think the indigenous nations around the Pacific Basin that you invaded and then subjugated, and in some cases enslaved, a lot of cases killed,
Probably
really brutal occupation, would have a differing view.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would argue against. It's like that's the official museum in the capital, and they're still saying this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what I found a little bit hard to digest.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Ian, for joining us in the studio today. To find out more about Ian's work and also the book, The Hiroshima Men, you can go to iainmacgregor.com. Ian has also very graciously written a piece for our news site, Lessons from Fire, What Hiroshima, Tariffs, and Japan's rising far right have in common. There'll be a link for that in the description, along with a link to Ian's website. For more quality and independent journalism from a whole host of really talented contributors, please consider taking out a subscription to our monthly periodical, Byline Times, at subscribe.bylinetimes.com. Thank you.